Well, good morning. I hope you all have had an incredible Easter. It's been 1 week. I hope that weekend was amazing. Hope you feel rejuvenated and maybe like you've figuratively taken off that heavy winter coat. Maybe it's the changes of season. That's always nice for me. I know that I just feel more like mentally and spiritually energized right now. I feel like I have more clarity than normal. And technically, we celebrate New Year's at midnight on January 1st. But for me, I always feel like Easter Sunday is really the beginning of the new year. I don't know if you guys feel like that or not, but that's how I feel. And honestly, it's been great. But I tend to put a lot of pressure and expectations into Holy Week because for many churches across the world, especially Christian churches, Holy Week is like the Super Bowl week of the entire year. And, part of what I sensed last Sunday was like a new beginning. It's probably also this massive relief that I feel when we've completed or kind of finished the Lenten season and Easter. And we get to move forward. This is a new year. So I'm pretty focused right now. I'm clear-minded, and I feel like we've made it. We have made it here, and we're still here. But even as spring ushers in new life, sometimes the weight doesn't lift. I don't know if you're feeling that today, and maybe you feel pressure and expectation, and you feel crushed by that a little bit, or maybe a lot. Sometimes we feel undone. And I have during this season before. And sometimes it feels like life is just unraveling before us. So that may be where you're at right now still. One person knew this feeling all too well. And he was a disciple of Christ. His name was Peter. He did something no one except Jesus expected, and it haunted him. The Gospel of Luke tells the story. And it extends past the resurrection, past Easter. But to understand what haunted Peter, we actually have to go back a few days before Easter. Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. The temple police and the chief priest took him away, and Peter actually drew his sword and took an ear off of one of the high priest's slaves. And let's just say he probably wasn't aiming for the ear. I think that's a pretty good assumption. Plus, Jesus had been preaching this message of peace that we've been talking about for several weeks. So he was probably like, no, that's just not what we're doing anymore, Peter. So go ahead and put the sword down. You still don't get it, but that's okay. You'll get it eventually. And you know what he did? He put the ear back. That's what he did. The Gospel of Luke says Jesus touched his ear and healed the slave. Now, as a refresher, earlier in the night, Peter said, I am prepared to go to prison, even death for you, Jesus. However, Jesus said, I tell you, Peter, the rooster will not crow this day until you have denied me 3 times. So Jesus predicted this denial. Then we come to the 22nd chapter of Luke, verse 54. This is where we're at today. It says, Then they seized Jesus and led him away, bringing him into the high priest's house. But Peter was following at a distance. When they had kindled a charcoal fire in the middle of a courtyard and sat together, Peter sat among them. Then a servant girl, seeing him in the firelight, stared at him and said, This man also was with him. But he denied it, saying, Woman, I do not know him. A little later, someone else on seeing Peter said, You are also one of them. But Peter said, Man, I am not. Then an hour later, they kept insisting, Surely this man was with the Galilean. But Peter said, Man, I do not know what you're talking about. And the Gospel of Luke says at that point, the rooster crowed. Jesus turned and looked at Peter. Then Peter remembered his words, and he went out and wept bitterly. That's a moment. I don't think I would ever forget that moment. And I think, imagine or think of your closest friends or family. Just think of them. The shame you must feel denying that you even know them. And that's what Peter did. The shame must have followed Peter kind of like a shadow. I think it was just constantly following him right after that. And the image of the charcoal fire in front of him, seared in his memory, representing this shameful moment, this extremely shameful moment in his life. But then we fast forward to post-resurrection Jesus, chapter 21 of the Gospel of John this time, not the Gospel of Luke. For whatever reason, Luke decided not to include the story that I'm about to tell, but John does. So it says the disciples are back up north. They're fishing in the Sea of Galilee, way back up north, no longer in Jerusalem where all the things went down, where Jesus was crucified and resurrected. Jesus appears on the shore here, but they don't recognize him. And Jesus yells out, "Hey, I hear you're having trouble catching fish. Why don't you just throw the nets on the other side?" So they do, and they catch so much fish that they can't even bring the net back into the boat. Then John refers to himself, as he likes to, as the one Jesus loved, and says, "Hey, it's Jesus." So Peter throws on some clothes because apparently fish is naked. I don't know. Didn't know that was a thing. And he jumps into the sea and gets to Jesus first this time. Last race was to the empty tomb, and John won that one. So I guess he figured he'd give Peter this one. They bring the boat ashore, and what does Peter see but a charcoal fire? Do you remember the charcoal fire? And maybe his thoughts rush back to that night where he stood in front of this charcoal fire, warming himself and eventually denying Jesus 3 times the shame. But Jesus said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, I do. I love you." Jesus said to him, "Well, then feed my lambs." A second time, as Jesus stood on the shore with Peter, he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And he said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Then he said, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the third time, you catching the references here, the symbolic nature of this, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter felt hurt because he said it the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep." The charcoal fire, the 3 questions. Peter knew all too well the weight that doesn't lift, the past mistakes and the feeling of life unraveling before him. He rushed to the shore at the invitation of his teacher. And he wanted nothing more to be in his presence, to be loved again, to feel accepted, to feel like everything's going to be okay. Do you want that? I know I want that. You also may know the weight, and it feels like nothing will ever redeem the past, and maybe even that nothing can ever relieve the pressures of the future. But Jesus tells Peter he is still qualified to lead. You know how? He says, "Feed my sheep." He says, "Teach my children God's love." Feed my sheep, Peter. You're still qualified. And that's what he's saying. You know, when I came to Green Bay, it was just over 5 years ago, and I was at the end of my rope. Just before that in Washington, D.C., I had had a great run in ministry at my church, and I was in music ministry at that point. I had loads of confidence and passion just like running through my veins, and I was feeling this calling to lead a church one day. But before we left D.C., I had a falling out with one of my pastor friends at the church, and I said some hurtful things. And while I also felt betrayed, I know he did too. It really left me wondering, though, like, am I even qualified to be a pastor? And once we moved to Green Bay, I was in the pit of despair, and I mean that. I felt great depression and sadness, and I felt small and unworthy. Like, what major defect keeps me from doing what God called me to do, what God called me to do? It took me almost 2 years in Green Bay before that weight kind of began to lift off of my shoulders. And I met with my pastor, Mark McCandless, actually the former pastor here at PCC. And I was still working at another church at the time, full time, and he offered Chrissy and I an opportunity to lead. He believed we were qualified, you know? He believed in us. and we started a Thursday night church service here. And it gave me hope. It really did. And I found my passion again. All that was lost came back, and my confidence. And this is what led me back into the calling for my life. Someone believed in me. Someone said, I don't care where you've been or what you've done. I want you to lead, and here's the freedom to do it. Feed my sheep. I think that's what Jesus did for Peter, honestly. I think that's what this story invites us into. If there's ever been a weight too heavy to bear, there's a gospel that promises to lift it when we're ready. I want to say that again. If there's ever a weight too heavy to bear, the gospel message promises to lift it when we're ready. If there's shame that follows us like a shadow, there must be light. We know that. If we feel like we're stranded at sea, there's a voice calling us to shore. And when we live in shame, we know that shame controls. Shame controls. Brene Brown says this about shame. We judge people in areas where we are vulnerable to shame. That's just saying not only are we unfair to ourselves when we live in shame, but we are unfair to others. Maybe each one of us would surprise ourselves if we stepped into our own callings, into our own purpose and passion. Maybe we'd become more accepting of others, like Jesus is. Maybe that's part of what would happen. Maybe we'd be known less for who we exclude as a church community and more for who we include. If we are called to be imitators of Christ, imago Christi, what if we are empowered, and what if we empower others to find our own unique passion and purpose? And when others feel lost, what if we called them to shore? Let's pray. Dear God, who can reclaim the shameful charcoal memories in our lives, please give us the strength to simply take the next step toward purpose and passion. God, let us remember Peter's story of reclamation and redemption, and may it give us hope to live into our calling despite the failures of the past and the pressures of the future. Help us to know that you are faithful to the end, and ultimately, most importantly, that it's going to be okay, that we are held. I know that you see us for who we are and who we are made to be, so I pray that we can do the same for our sisters and brothers. Amen.